alive. So
Yeah.
it seems like I cracked the cheat code of Zoom. But anyway, so before the transition, we were talking about the idea of just white people feeling like they own things.
And then when they don't own the power to those things, it's oppression,
Yeah.
right? Which I think is an excellent point you just made. I have this very interesting story. Maybe you've heard about it. It came out in the news a few years ago, 2016, I believe. And it's going to come out in the next video on whiteness as property, by the way. There's this white cop, right? He takes one of those ancestry.com tests, DNA tracking thing, right? He discovers that he's 18% African. So says the ancestry gods. And he thinks it's a good idea to go to work and tell all of his white cop friends that he's 18% black. So, of course, all of them make fun of him. They're doing things like whispering Black Lives Matter to him while he's walking in the hallway. His what do you call the top chief? There we go.
Chief,
the
yeah.
chief, yeah, his chief started calling him Kunta, and just like they would do like black power fists while he's walking in the. So long story short, he sues the police department for racism. Yeah.
Oh Lord.
And he won. He sued for $500,000, but he was awarded, I think it was either $85,000 or $65,000 plus 2 paid months of salary. So experiencing racism as a white person is worth $85,000 apparently. But you know, the what's interesting here is I think that it's the power. What the reason why he won such a large settlement amount is because whiteness in that case was treated as though it was his property. And when other people infringed upon his right to be a white person, his right to experience those settled expectations of specifically not experiencing racism, right? When you fuck with those expectations, all of a sudden that becomes a form of oppression. And that's what this guy was talking about. He's like, I'm oppressed because they're treating me as though I was black and I'm white, and I just wanted to say that I'm part black or whatever. You know, and I like things like that, where I think the settlement was in 2019. That was like what, 4 years ago?
Yeah.
4 years ago, where we're rewarding white police officers with $65,000 because somebody made a joke about him at work, right? I actually think the whole thing is very revealing in terms of anti-blackness, right? Because he wasn't experiencing racism towards his whiteness. He was experiencing anti-blackness. And experiencing anti-blackness as a white person just like does not compute, right? And so that is why I think the courts just kind of took his side and was like, yeah, you're right. This is really messed up. You're a white person. You shouldn't have to experience this. $65,000.
Yeah. And then what's really, again, like basically what you and I are describing, because like before the cutoff, is that when there are situations and moments where white Americans like engage in racialization in like a very head-on way of like, this is like, imagine what it feels like if you're at 100% power. Then they use the very institutions that were designed to protect non-white people from terrorism and different levels of violence. And instead of it just gets really murky, because then like they'll use those systems as a weapon, when in reality it's like not explicitly designed for them in that way, but because the like institutions, whether it be the courts or the criminal justice system, what have you, they're not designed to like tackle with nuance in that particular way if you just like roll into it as a judge. That's kind of why when there was that sort of like panic over Ketanji Jackson Brown, over like, she's going to change the Supreme Court, it's going to be all racialized. And it's like, we've had Clarence Thomas for how long? We're good. We're going to be like, and that's not a slight to her, but it's just that like there's only so much you can do within an institution as a judge, where like you'll just get those like those speeches of like, I did the best that I could. This is the only way of doing it, and maybe on the next one or the next one or the next one. And when in reality, it's like, yeah, like for some institutions, for a lot of institutions, I would argue, is that you're going to have to like completely reimagine how that system functions if you're trying to have protections for non-white people and just non-white people seeing themselves in those institutions. Like within academia, for instance, one thing that's like really kind of pervasive, and maybe you can speak on this a little bit, is I'm very skeptical of the non-white person ending up in the study of themselves and their in-group pipeline. Where like, okay, if you're a black person and you're kind of curious about sociology, Africana studies.
Yes. That is your place over there in the corner with the other kids over there.
Yeah. And then,
exactly.
And then what happens is you'll get people who say like wild things where it's like, why would you go to school just to get a bachelor's in like in Africana studies? Like, what does that do for it? And then something that like I've argued is that in a lot of ways, it appears, because again, like I'm on the outside looking into it, where it just kind of seems that like if you do have a level of like interest in sociology and the study of race and the study of like whatever that exists, whether it be in a critical race theory sort of framework that can go pretty much anywhere and everywhere, or something more specific, you kind of get pigeonholed into like Africana studies,
Latinx
studies,
which is where I'm at right now. Yeah.
And I guess like, how do you as a person within academia like resist that slide? Or rather like it does rather question like how has that slide may have manifested for you, and then like how, like what levels of resistance or survival strategies exist within that?
Yeah, so it really feels, this particular situation really feels like a double-edged sword. Something that I'm actually, there's talk at my university to where that they want to, as a cost-saving measure, want to merge Africana studies with Latinx studies into one department. Why? To save money, right? So you have less deans to hire, less professors, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Less websites to maintain, like a whole bunch of things like that, right? Cost saving. And then they're like, oh, this is going to foster, really rich dialogue between Africana and I'm just like, you think we weren't talking to each other before? Like the interdisciplinary benefits would be if you maybe forced your economics people to talk to critical race theorists, right? To talk to your medical field department, have them talk to Africana studies people so that they can learn the history of racism within the medical field, right? Those are dialogues that I think should happen. But being pigeonholed is something universities really like to do, whether it's because they think it makes sense, right? Oh, put all the people of color over there in their one building, right? Which is, by the way, very a high-tech form of segregation. Just saying right there, to isolate individual disciplines on the basis of race. That's real funny sounding. I don't know if administrators don't realize that part, but whatever. And we were already talking about that in critical race theory called the apartheid of knowledge. The studies are there already, right? What I do though, and also the Africana department, they are so against the merging. And it's precisely because for them, for Africana studies, for example, their argument is we need our own space for our Black students that are here. Latinx studies are like, we need our own space too for our brown students or for our Afro-Latinx students, right? So in a way, the isolation gives us a form of protection when it comes to the students, because there really does become a racialized space for racialized persons, and it becomes our space. It's for us and it's by us, right? So in that sense, I like being a little bit autonomous from the rest of the university. I don't like it when they start using it as an excuse to cut funding for our programs, and that's where it ends up going. That is the part that I'm against. I like the space. I like the isolation. I don't think it's people of color's job to go over and save other different disciplines. If they want to come to us and ask us questions, cool. But yeah, so like I said, very double-edged sword, mixed feelings when it comes to that for me. Because in a way, I kind of like it because it's literally conversations with, my own people. Like if I'm surrounded by Latinx folks or Afro-Latinx folks, and I feel like I'm at home, that makes me feel good, just the way I know it makes a lot of students feel good too.
Yeah, and it's interesting as you bring it up, because I'm kind of like, to be 100% transparent, I'm torn about this as well, where there's like, I understand, like I've heard all the dean administrative arguments of like, but it always feels like really, really weird where instead of, I'm trying to be very careful with my language here. Instead of like, how do we make this a holistic approach that recognize that every field of study intersect with race in some way, and then allowing in a lot of ways it would allow for like your departments to expand, Africana Studies department to expand, because it's going to need a lot more people to I will say, for lack of a better word, fight that fight of trying to like approach racialization and race head on. But at the same time, like there's always this sort of like trap of like consolidation, and like the way that we can save everybody is by like consolidating it together. And in a lot of ways, it's like this weird level of integration that's kind of missing the plot, where it's like, because something that I talk like almost ad nauseum in my stream is that one of the reasons why I think integration failed in the United States is that it wasn't the idea that white America and white society integrate and share with non-white people. It was just kind of this, you can play along with all the other non-white folks, but on your terms. And since it's on your terms, you can navigate with it however you'd like. And then like the South was like, we can just go, right? Yeah. Whatever the South, really just like the South, like basically like white people in cities, like we can just dip, right? Like that's a thing. And then the government's like, yeah, we're gonna give you incentives. It's like, huh? Like don't just come over here, this new nice little area.
Yep.
Or in the sake of academia, where it was just like in the face of like, and I try to explain this to people like in my space of like, in the face of academia integrating with non-white people, they decided to build whole new buildings. Like that is turbo racism, where it's like, hey, integrate with black people. No. Okay, but we'll build them a new school. And then like the institutions were just like, I'm listening. It's like, so we build this place, right? And then we put them all in there, and then they get all the education and the things that they wanted. Were low key, they just wanted better quality schools in the first place. But if we weren't listening to that, but that's okay. But
right.
Look how nice it is. And then we're just gonna, that's it. It's like, huh? Like, yeah, we built it. That's it, right? And then they just kind of moved on with the rest of their day.
Yeah, and that was like one of the major failures of desegregation too. For one thing, I wonder if they, well, not to steal somebody else's point, but like Derek Bell, for example, studied segregation a lot. He's another critical race theorist for those of y'all out there. And he kind of said in so many words, desegregation was something lawyers were obsessed with. If you went to actually ask Black parents, do you want desegregation? Well, the answer was usually, why would I want my kids in these white schools where the white principal's gonna fucking hate them and they're gonna experience vitriol from white teachers and from their white student counterparts, right? Maybe what we really want is just equal access to resources. So give us the good schools, and we'll make it work. But that's not how the story went, right? It became integration, and then it became, okay, we're gonna give them the minimal amount of money so that they can say we tried to desegregate. Look at this evidence. We funded this school for you guys, and then for some reason all the white people left. We didn't do that. Yeah. That's individual choice, right? That has nothing to do with us. Well, yeah, if you incentivize people for white flight, they're gonna leave. Right? So yeah, desegregation is a super mixed bag. I'm not saying it shouldn't have happened. I'm saying the way it happened maybe didn't come out the way we planned.
Right. And that's like, to be clear, that's also like a better way of articulating the idea that I was trying to lay down, where these, instead of like kind of looking like objectively at like how groups responded to the situation and kind of just like understanding the argument on its face, because there is some nuance to be said of like, well, you know, if Latinx studies is something for all people that is of value, how do we create an environment where white people feel like they can enter into those conversations in those spaces, but then there's like entering in without the centralization, but allowing them to just like to dance, like basically like everybody can come into the club, but we want to make sure that like everybody comes into the club without there being this like pervasive centering of certain ideas and stuff like that, because that I think is very tricky, because like when I took social justice when I was in college, it was just black people, and like it was nice to not feel myself vibrate in a room for once, but it's like, man, like like what? And then like universities don't like engage with that, where it's like, why are all the black kids and all of their like, and again, like I if I were going to back into education, I would be studying that directly, of like enrollment of non-white centered studies, and just like that, those cohorts, because like there's not a lot of white people engaging with that idea. But to be fair, because that's like a segue into the next thing, there has been a emergence of white Americans in particular, like coming to terms with their racialized identity. And what that means, it's like a thing that exists, but that isn't, it's like this weird kind of like, white people exist, but they also don't, but they do, and it has consequences, but they still don't exist, but they do.
Yes.
And
the old race is a social construct argument, right?
Yeah. And I guess the next segue into is, how has that been for you in a, like, we're in a, I don't know if anybody in my chat, like, this might be news to somebody, that we're in a very weird racial place in America, where for the first time, or maybe not in the first time, like another emergence of the same sort of fight of white people coming to terms with their racialization and how that affects different groups of people, which comes into a boom of enrollment in a lot of college courses. I'm wondering like how that's been for you, if there's been or even been a shift at all.
I mean, I didn't experience a shift in my school, because it's like, I don't know what the numbers are, but it's very much a black and brown school in the middle of Brooklyn, right? So I think the students I see the least in my classes are white students, but there's definitely plenty of brave white students willing to sit in there with a class where it almost seems like a reverse tokenized type of experience in there, because it'll be like one or two white students that are in there. And I have to say it over and over again, when we're talking about whiteness, we're not talking about white people, we're talking about whiteness, right? So that's usually what I separate. And whiteness is a concept that is real, because we say it's real. So sure, social construct, all of that argument, fine, good. It's real because we say it's real and we experience it as real. So my particular school has not really been affected by wokeism or whatever it's being called, right? But to me, the story of white persons coming to terms with being white identified persons, being not receiving their privileges from things like merit, but instead things like systemic racism, right? That story of white people coming to that consciousness, I think, is the story of wokeism that we're hearing on the Republican side of politics right now, the right-wing side. It seems like there's a group of white, powerful Republicans that absolutely hate the fact that some white identified persons are actually speaking against whiteness. And so that almost becomes enemy number one. Anything that seems to degrade the superiority of whiteness is considered wokeism for whatever reason, right? And I've said it a bunch of times on Twitter. I wonder how fast I would be fired from a Florida university. I'm pretty sure one class, and I'd be fired for saying something that offends somebody because they think I'm talking about them personally when I'm talking about whiteness. I'm not talking about any of the white people that happen to be in the room.
Yeah.
Right. So I think this racial reckoning, I guess if we can call it, it's not that it's not important. It is important. I guess it's just a double-edged sword, like anything else, you know, like you have people that are started, carrying the banner of wokeness, whether they're white and whether that word was actually taken away from, Black English. That's a whole nother story, right? But that story itself, the critical consciousness of whiteness, I think it's a necessary move. And we probably need more of it. And then also, why not have white people do the work of educating other white people? That's probably should be their job anyways. Like, why is it our job to go and educate, white identified persons, right? So I think it's a good thing, but with every good thing, there's going to be a backlash. Any kind of progress, there will be like a backlash just as strong or stronger. And that's what we're seeing with this wokeism political stuff.
Yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned that because when like one of the things that I talk about is my war with white women. And what that means is my war with white women as an identifiable group and electorate in the United States, and all of the like settled habits of thought and action that, like, when we hear like what white women invokes, because something that it's very pervasive and very hard to navigate around is that there are well-intentioned, like, and there's different groups for that. Like in the modern political discourse, I describe it as the mama bear movement, which is just like a large electorate of predominantly white women fighting against education, fighting against educational concepts. And something that I had to recenter my brain around, because I go to their meetings, is that they're a passively racist group of people. And the thing is that, like, again, like systems not people. If I recognize, like, okay, there is a socialization, a culturation that leads to these ideas, and a lot of times it's like I think a part of me is like, they don't need. They need this. They need these groups of people, like asterisk and 9,000 pages of fine print. But for a lot of white Americans, and particularly those who end up being like identifiably white women and mothers, like there's a lot of like in-group conversation that needs to happen that isn't happening. So what will happen is that like there is some like truths, and that, in this phase and this transition of white identified people like coming to terms with their identity and how that's hurting people, you'll get people who overcorrect, and then they'll have people who like that's the best way I can describe it. They'll overcorrect and do sort of like quote unquote like tiki chants in their math class, or they'll they'll just like buckle down and then just be giving Ron DeSantis swords at their national conventions. It's just this
Yeah.
really weird, because again, like the reason why, like when I mentioned this, like the war with white women, it's like for me it's just the war of that, like the settled habits of thought and action around that identity, and other electorates and other groups of people have different like manifestations and actions around like the racialization of other groups of people.
Mm-hmm.
Because like, yeah, like for white Americans, like, yeah, there's a lot of in-group conversations that are messy and complicated, and like I'd love to listen to them. I'll be on the fly on the wall and just be like, I'm gonna just observe, I'm just here to watch. But at the same time, like they can't do it by themselves. So it's like this weird type of I don't know what the word is, but this weird type of exchange that needs to happen that's trying. I can feel it trying to happen.
Yeah.
But it's like kind of interesting. Like my thoughts is like where the next step is going to be, and like what's this going to become.
Yeah, so it's trying to happen against a current that has been in existence since like the beginning of the United States, right? So what I'm hearing from what you're saying, if I can rephrase it a little bit,
Sure.
The war on white women aspect, what I'm hearing more so, you know, and referring back to think systems, not people, right?
Yeah.
What I'm hearing is more of a critique of white supremacist patriarchy.
Yes.
More so than white women themselves.
Right.
Which I think is a little, it's different in the sense that if we focus our energy towards the white supremacist patriarchy ideology, then we know what we're fighting against.
Right.
Now, obviously, like any identifiable group is going to be a mixed bag, right? There's going to be self-identified white women that are on very different parts of the spectrum in terms of like racial progress or whatever. But I think what is important is a lot of times white person, maybe it's not even just white persons, a lot of times for something to be really convincing, to be convinced that something needs to change has to come from within the group, right? But what do you do when the entire group, let's say in this room of like white mom parents or whatever, what happens when the entire room has been socialized since birth through white supremacist patriarchy, right? That's gonna shut down a whole lot of conversations that first time a person of color speaks, it's already like, no, that's not our problem.
Yeah.
That's like your problem or whatever. And no, white supremacist patriarchy is everybody's problem. It's not just white women's problems. It's everybody's problem, you know?
Yeah.
So yeah. I definitely see your point there. I think I even made a video on, I think it's called Will White Women Save America? And I'm definitely getting at the point, at the aspect of it's not white women themselves, it's
Right.
the ideology, the patriarchy, the white supremacy underneath it that keeps positioning white women as though they are the protectors of certain realms, like the school or whatever, right? Which is historically has been feminized, I suppose. That's the profession or whatever has been feminized. So yeah, and if you're dealing within a patriarchal society where your only power is to control something like a classroom, then of course they're probably going to get extra protective because that's the only space they have power over. Right. So when we start framing it like that, it's not that I give passes or excuses to people for, you know, being racist, but at the same time, I have to think, okay, you know what? One time at one point in my life, I probably said some fucked up shit too, and I changed. So there is a little bit of hope there that this particular, let's say a group of white moms at a parent meeting. I do have hope that there's the ability to change somewhere in there, someplace, even if we can't see it. So yeah, that's my rant on
Yeah. Yeah, and to be clear, like, because my chat reminds me that, like, not everybody watches my content in good faith. So when they hear, like, for example, because like when they hear war on white women, it's like, what does that mean? What do you mean by that?
Yeah.
And it's like, easy there, like, but and that's like and you can probably get into like the nuances and like the issues that language bring up, because like for instance because the reason why I bring that up, like the war with white women and stuff like that, is like I've been sitting in a lot to different meetings. I've been paying attention to different political groups that have been manifesting itself, and a lot of times, like, I understand what they're saying. Like, they're very clear. Like their claim is correct, where it's like institutions have ignored people. But then it's like the clarification of that, like, and something that I try to mention, like within like the full elaboration of the war on white women critique, is that like the public school is not designed for anybody. It's like anybody, like no matter if you're white or black or Latinx or what have you, like it's not designed for anybody. But the people who are going to feel that the hardest are all the way at the bottom of. So it's like where you start like adding more cards to the deck. It's like, okay, which one of these decks in totality has the most disadvantage? And then what happens is like how it constructs itself is that, and I mentioned this a lot, where it's like women broadly don't have to feel, and this is specifically in public education, because once you get higher up, it gets really weird fast, where like in public education, like there are girls, like young girls who get 12 to 15 years of seeing women in front facing leadership positions and seeing different expressions of that. And that's a powerful thing. And that's a thing that if you recognize, where it's like, one part of this might require indirectly a lot of women losing work. It's like, that's like, what do you mean? Like, that's like, like, they're fighting back, not fighting back in an aggressive way, but it's like, yeah, like you're probably gonna buckle down and like recognize like this small shift can feel like a tidal wave if you're not careful. And because like one of the things that would have been really cool in the Desegregate Schools Summit, if they said like, hey, like what type of protections can we give to those Black teachers who are now entering into integrated environments? Because like it would have been really interesting to see like, okay, we start with Brown v. Board of Education from an administrative level, from a teacher level, and these happen all at the same time, but like, okay, let's integrate the teacher body so that these white folks, unfortunately, or white identified people understand how to interact with these cohorts in the same age group, and then manifest itself like socialization from children. And then maybe if we're not careful, the fight still happens. Maybe if we're not careful, the firing still happens. But it would lead to a totally different landscape of education and how groups feel comfortable with each other. Because again, like there's a lot of books that talk about this. Like even in the face of an integrated like society, you get pockets that integrate or segregate for a bunch of different reasons. And sometimes that self-segregation, that self-isolation is intentional. And sometimes it's just kind of how the cards lay out. Where like we didn't want this to be a completely all Latinx class for Latin American studies, but here we are. And then like how do we move and navigate with that? Because in a lot of ways, like what you mentioned earlier, where it's like well-intentioned administrators can just create segregated programs, just thinking like, oh yeah, like people are gonna just go into this how they feel. It's like, well, hang on, that's not necessarily the case. Like sometimes you're gonna need to have a bit more of like a concentrated effort.
Yeah, and that's what's really that it's tricky, because you have a person's individual good intentions completely just overpowered, bypassed by the history of white supremacy. So in a lot of cases, like me personally, I guess my approach to understanding racism is almost to put individual intentions aside, because there's things much more powerful historically, if we're considering, like, for example, the inertia of white supremacist ideology in the United States, right? An individual person's intention to do something good is not going to win against that. Like, that's history. That's that was there, centuries before you got into the mood of having a good intention, So it's always tricky, because are we depending then on, let's say, the individual intentions of many teachers or many administrators, or where do we actually need to direct the change towards? Are we thinking at a massive scale? Should we concentrate on single schools? Maybe, like, let's concentrate all our effort on a single school, and then maybe other schools around it will follow. I don't think we quite understand what to do with the problem of racism yet. We've been trying, though. It's been a couple hundred years. Maybe we'll get there and we'll figure it out. But I don't know. I'm not even convinced, though, that racism is a problem that can be solved, to be real honest. I think it's just, it goes to a deeper issue with people having a problem with difference, just in general. If somebody lives differently than you, that becomes an excuse to prejudice somebody, for example, or to discriminate against somebody, for example. So if we didn't have the concept race, I really think it would just be replaced with something else, like class or heteronormativity or whatever. There's going to be a constant re-articulation of the race concept into something else. And so I don't even know if racism is the thing that I'm wondering if the fundamental problem is the problem with people having a problem with difference.
Yeah.
In general, just in general, or a lack of appreciation for difference. If we were, like, socialized into a world where difference is glorified as something amazing or beautiful, or at the center of communities or of families, positive stuff, maybe we would appreciate forms of difference. But as it is right now, the American conversation, the American narrative is assimilation, which means the negation of difference. So we've had this attitude since we started the United States, right? So that's going to be a problem going forward for, like, forever until we start facing that part, So,
man, that's a really no notes. So let me do two things. I'm gonna reset the room.
Oh yeah.
And then I have, like, one more thing I want to pick your brain about, because it's kind of Amy Wax time, but not necessarily Amy Wax time. Yeah, well, I'm gonna pick your brain on that. So give me like 2 seconds.